The church of St. Michael stood grey against a greyer sky on the morning of October 15th, 1814, its ancient stones weeping with the moisture that hung heavy in the air and promised rain before the noon hour struck. Eleanor Ashworth watched her own funeral from the shadows of the gallery above, her fingers gripping the wooden railing so tightly her knuckles had gone white beneath the rough brown wool of the servant's dress Harriet had procured for her, and she wondered if the dead felt this strange mixture of terror and relief when they finally slipped free of their earthly bonds. Below her, arranged in rigid rows of black silk and sombre wool, the mourners had gathered to pay their respects to a woman who had supposedly drowned in the River Avon 3 days prior, her body swept away by currents too swift and too cold for recovery, and Eleanor found herself cataloguing each face with the detachment of one who has already begun to think of herself as a ghost. Her mother sat in the front pew, Lady Catherine's face a mask of appropriate grief that Eleanor knew concealed not sorrow but calculation, for this death had complicated matters considerably where the engagement settlement was concerned. Harriet sat beside her aunt, and only Eleanor could detect the slight tremor in her cousin's gloved hands, the nearly imperceptible way her gaze flickered toward the gallery and away, maintaining the ruse that had cost them both sleepless nights and whispered conspiracies in locked rooms. The coffin at the front of the church was simple and elegant, lined with white silk that no one would ever see because no grieving relative had requested a final viewing, and it contained nothing but stones wrapped in linen to give it the appropriate weight of a young woman's remains. Eleanor had thought she would feel triumphant watching this elaborate performance, this grand deception that would set her free from Marcus Pembroke's cruel hands and crueler words. But instead she felt hollow, as if the empty coffin below had somehow drained her of the capacity to feel anything at all. Then he entered, and everything changed. Frederick Sinclair, Earl of Thornwood, walked into the church alone, his tall frame rigid with a grief so genuine it seemed to emanate from him like heat from a flame, and Eleanor pressed herself deeper into the shadows, confused by the intensity of his mourning. She had met him perhaps 4 times in the crowded ballrooms of London society, had exchanged perhaps a dozen words of polite conversation, and yet he wore a black mourning band on his arm as if he had lost someone dear beyond measure. He approached the coffin after the service concluded, when most mourners had retreated to murmur condolences to her mother, and Eleanor watched him stand there in perfect stillness, his dark head bowed, his hands clasped before him. She could not see his face from this angle, could not read the expression that made his shoulders curve inward, as if protecting a wound. But she could see his lips move in words too soft for anyone else to hear. She leaned forward without thinking, driven by a curiosity she could not name, and the old wood of the gallery floor creaked beneath her borrowed shoes. He did not look up, but his whispered words carried in the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling, rising to her hiding place like prayers ascending to heaven. "I will wait for you," he said to the empty coffin, to the woman he believed lay within it cold and still and forever beyond his reach. "However long it takes, I will wait." Rain began to fall against the windows as Eleanor fled down the servants' stairs, her heart pounding with something far more dangerous than fear, for she had just discovered that someone had loved her, truly loved her, and she had killed herself to escape a man who never had. The rain had intensified by evening, hammering against the windows of the small cottage where Eleanor had hidden herself these past 3 days, while the village mourned a woman who watched them from behind drawn curtains and held her breath every time footsteps passed on the muddy lane outside. Harriet arrived at 7:30, soaked through despite her heavy cloak, her face pale with exhaustion, and something else that Eleanor recognized as fear barely contained beneath a mask of determined composure. "We haven't much time." Harriet said, as she pressed a leather purse into Eleanor's trembling hands. Her voice low, even though they were alone in the cramped room that smelled of damp wool and tallow candles. £50 and a letter of introduction to a Mrs. Agnes Fairfax in Edinburgh, a widow who takes in respectable young women as governesses and asks few questions about their pasts. Eleanor clutched the purse to her chest and tried to find words adequate to express what her cousin had risked for her, but Harriet was already moving, pulling items from a worn valise and laying out the disguise that would carry Eleanor north to freedom. The servant's dress Eleanor had worn to the funeral would serve for travel, but Harriet had brought a bonnet with a wider brim, and as she positioned it on Eleanor's head, her fingers brushed against the fading bruise that still marked Eleanor's left cheekbone, the yellow and purple remnant of Marcus's final gift the night before she had walked into the River Avon and let the current carry away her shawl, her shoes, and every trace of the woman she had been. "He came to the house that evening demanding to see you," Harriet whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she adjusted the bonnet to better conceal the mark. "He was convinced you had been planning something, that you meant to shame him somehow, and when your mother said you had retired early with a headache, he pushed past her and went to your room himself." Eleanor remembered that night with a clarity that made her stomach turn, the way Marcus had gripped her chin and forced her to look at him while he explained in precise and terrifying detail what would happen if she ever tried to leave him, how he would destroy not only her but everyone she loved, how her mother would lose her position in society, and Harriet would never find a husband once he spread the appropriate rumors. The bruise had come when she tried to pull away, his signet ring catching her cheekbone with enough force to make her see stars. And it was in that moment of blinding pain that Eleanor had finally understood there would be no escape through conventional means, no appeal to family or law or church that would free her from a man who viewed her as property to be used and discarded at will. "The coach departs from the crossroads at midnight," Harriet continued, pressing the valise into Eleanor's hands along with her mother's locket. The only piece of her old life Eleanor had asked to keep. Eleanor pulled her cousin into a fierce embrace, feeling the shudder of suppressed sobs in Harriet's thin shoulders. And then she stepped out into the rain and the darkness, pausing only once to look back at the distant lights of the town where she had been born and loved and died, before turning her face toward Scotland and the uncertain promise of a life that belonged only to herself. The first snow of winter fell on Thornwood Hall in the second week of November, dusting the gardens with white powder that softened the sharp edges of the boxwood hedges and settled in delicate drifts against the stone walls where climbing roses had long since surrendered their blooms to the coming cold. Frederick Sinclair stood at the window of his study watching the flakes descend, his hand pressed flat against the glass as if he might somehow reach through it to touch something beyond his grasp, and he wondered if she had loved the snow, if she had ever stood at a window like this and watched the world transform itself into something pure and silent and new. He had not left the estate since the funeral, except to visit her grave, a daily pilgrimage that had become as essential to him as breathing, and the servants had begun to whisper about the master's grief, about the black mourning band he never removed, and the simple silver ring he had taken to wearing on his smallest finger, a ring he had seen Eleanor admire once in a jeweller's window on Bond Street, her face lit with a pleasure she had quickly suppressed when Marcus Pembroke had steered her away with a possessive hand at her elbow. In Edinburgh, more than 400 miles to the north, the woman who had been Eleanor Ashworth sat in the modest but comfortable nursery of Mrs. Agnes Fairfax's townhouse, teaching two young girls the proper way to hold a watercolour brush while snow fell past the windows there as well, and she thought about how strange it was to be Miss Ellen Archer now, to answer to a name that did not belong to her, to smile at children who would never know that their governess was supposed to be dead and buried in a churchyard she would never see again. The hollow feeling that had plagued her, since the funeral had not faded entirely, but it had transformed into something more bearable, a quiet emptiness that she could almost ignore when the Fairfax girls laughed at her jokes or when Mrs. Fairfax pressed an extra cup of tea into her hands on cold evenings and told her she was doing wonderfully with the children. She had begun keeping a journal, writing by candlelight in the small room she had been given at the top of the house, and tonight she found herself describing the stranger from the funeral, the tall man in mourning who had whispered words she still could not forget, words that haunted her dreams and made her wonder what it might have felt like to be loved like that, truly loved, by someone who asked nothing in return. At Thornwood Hall, Frederick knelt before the gravestone that bore Eleanor's name and the dates that bracketed a life cut far too short, and he spoke to her as he did every afternoon, telling her about the snow and the silence and the way he had found a sketch tucked into a book of poetry she had donated to the church, a sketch of his own gardens rendered in her delicate hand, proof that she had seen him, had known his home, had perhaps thought of him even once before she died. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The morning light filtered pale and cold through the frosted windows of Mrs. Fairfax's townhouse on the 3rd day of December, and Eleanor stood at the nursery table watching young Charlotte Fairfax mix watercolors with more enthusiasm than precision, while her sister Amelia frowned at her own canvas with the concentrated displeasure of a 9-year-old who had expected perfection on her first attempt. "Try softer strokes, Eleanor," said gently, guiding Amelia's hand with her own, the way I showed you yesterday, "and let the water do the work for you." She had been teaching the girls to paint for nearly 3 weeks now, and she found herself looking forward to these lessons with an anticipation that surprised her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the grate, and everything to do with the simple pleasure of being useful, of being wanted, of building something that belonged to her alone. Far to the south, Frederick Sinclair stood on the banks of the River Avon, where Eleanor Ashworth had supposedly drowned, his boots sinking into the frozen mud as he watched the grey water slide past, with the same indifferent patience it had shown for centuries, and he thought about the conversation he had just finished with old Thomas Mercer, a fisherman who had worked this stretch of river for 40 years, and who had looked at Frederick with rheumy eyes, full of something like pity, when he said that no body had ever surfaced, not in all the weeks since the young lady went in, and that was strange, passing strange, because the river always gave up its dead eventually, usually within a fortnight, caught in the reeds downstream or washed up on the muddy banks where the current slowed. Frederick had felt something crack open in his chest at those words, something he had thought sealed forever beneath the weight of grief, and he had pressed the old man for details until his voice went hoarse, learning that the current had been gentle that day, that the water was not deep where the lady's shoes had been found, that in Thomas Mercer's professional opinion, formed over decades of intimate acquaintance with this river's moods and secrets, a body should have been recovered within days unless there was no body to recover. In London, in a study that smelled of brandy and barely contained rage, Marcus Pembroke read an anonymous letter that had arrived that morning, its contents brief and devastating, suggesting that his fiancée might not be as dead as everyone believed, and he summoned the investigator he had already hired, a man named Fleming, who wore a distinctive red waistcoat and asked no questions about why a grieving betrothed needed proof of a drowning that had already been accepted by the coroner and the church. Eleanor knew nothing of fishermen or anonymous letters or investigators in red waistcoats. as she watched Charlotte accidentally create something beautiful, a wash of blue and green that looked almost like the Scottish hills she could see from her window, and she felt for one precious moment that she might actually be safe, that the woman who had walked into that river might truly be dead and gone, leaving only Ellen Archer behind, a governess with paint-stained fingers and a heart that was slowly, cautiously, beginning to heal. The snow lay thick upon the ground when Frederick Sinclair's carriage pulled to a stop before the modest stone cottage, where Samuel Colborne had established his practice on the outskirts of the village, and the bitter cold of January had turned the world into a landscape of white and grey and silence, the kind of silence that seemed to swallow sound whole and leave nothing behind but the crunch of boots on frozen ground and the distant cry of winter birds seeking shelter from the wind. Frederick had spent the weeks since his conversation with the fisherman pursuing every thread he could find, following whispers and questions, and the careful trail of inconsistencies that had begun to form a picture he hardly dared to believe. And now he stood before the door of the man who had signed Eleanor's death certificate, the man who had examined her body and declared her gone, and he felt his heart beating so hard against his ribs that he wondered if the doctor would be able to hear it from inside. The door opened to reveal a man in his middle years with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he invited Frederick inside, hands that shook more violently when Frederick introduced himself and stated his purpose with the quiet precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind. "I am not here to accuse you of anything," Frederick said as they sat across from each other in the small parlor where a fire struggled against the cold. "I am here because I loved her, because I believe she may have had reason to disappear, and because I would rather know the truth and keep her secret than spend the rest of my life mourning a woman who might still be breathing somewhere in this world." Dr. Colborne's face crumpled like paper in a fist, and the story came pouring out in fragments and gasps, the sedative he had procured that slowed the heartbeat to nearly nothing, the bruises he had seen on Eleanor's arms and face and ribs, the way she had flinched when he touched her, and the way she had begged him to help her escape, because Marcus Pembroke had promised to kill her if she ever tried to leave him, had described in precise detail how he would make it look like an accident, and how no one would ever believe her because she was just a nervous woman prone to hysteria, and everyone knew how devoted he was to his beautiful fiancée. Frederick listened with his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles went white, and when the doctor finished speaking, when the fire had burned down to embers and the shadows had grown long across the floor, he leaned forward and took the trembling physician's hands in his own and said that he would never reveal what he had learned here today, that Eleanor's secret was safe with him, and that all he needed now was some small hint of where she might have gone, so that he could warn her that Marcus had hired an investigator who was even now following her trail through the winter countryside with the relentless patience of a hunting dog that has caught the scent of blood. The February thaw had begun to soften the edges of winter when Eleanor Ashworth, who had become so accustomed to answering to the name Ellen Archer that she sometimes forgot she had ever been anyone else, pushed open the door of Mr. Benjamin Greville's bookshop on a Thursday afternoon and breathed in the familiar scent of leather and paper and dust that had come to mean safety to her in ways she could not quite explain. Mr. Greville looked up from behind his cluttered counter with the warm smile he reserved for his favorite customers, and Eleanor felt something ease in her chest as she moved between the crowded shelves toward the section where he kept the volumes on natural history, the botanical illustrations, and pressed flower guides that had become her secret passion in these months of reinvention. She had begun wearing her hair differently since arriving in Edinburgh, softer and looser than the severe styles Marcus had preferred, and she caught a glimpse of herself in the shop's small window and hardly recognized the woman who looked back at her, a woman whose eyes held something other than fear, whose shoulders no longer curved inward as if bracing for a blow. Far to the south, in a coaching inn on the Great North Road, Frederick Sinclair sat across from an innkeeper's wife who remembered a young woman travelling alone in October, a quiet thing with a fading bruise on her cheek, who had paid for her passage in coins she counted out with trembling fingers. And Frederick felt his heart lurch with something between hope and anguish as the woman described how the girl had startled at every loud noise and kept her bonnet pulled low over her face as if she were afraid of being recognized. In London, in the townhouse that had once echoed with the sounds of parties and laughter, Marcus Pembroke dismissed his valet with a violence that left the man stumbling backward into the hallway, his crime nothing more than suggesting that perhaps the late Miss Ashworth had seemed unhappy in the weeks before her death. And Marcus stood alone in his study afterward, with his hands shaking and his jaw clenched so tight that his teeth ached, because he knew now that she was ill somewhere, knew it in his bones, and the thought of her breathing and walking and existing beyond his reach was a torment he could not endure. Eleanor purchased a book on Scottish wildflowers that afternoon, not knowing that the subject was Frederick's particular passion, not knowing that he had written a monograph on the flora of the Highlands that had been praised by the Royal Society, not knowing that in choosing this interest she was weaving an invisible thread between her new life and the man who was even now following her trail northward through the melting snow with the careful patience of someone who had learned that love required more than possession, more than demand, more than the desperate grasping that had nearly destroyed the woman he was trying to find. Frederick arrived in Edinburgh on the last day of February, exhausted and travel-worn and terrified of what he might discover, still wearing the black mourning band and the simple ring Eleanor had once admired, and he walked the unfamiliar streets with his heart pounding and his eyes searching every face for the ghost he refused to stop believing in. The weak February sun hung low in the sky on the afternoon of the 20th, casting long shadows across the cobblestones of the Royal Mile as Frederick Sinclair walked without destination through the unfamiliar streets of Edinburgh, his eyes scanning every face that passed him with the desperate hope of a man who had travelled hundreds of miles on nothing more than faith and fragments of evidence. And he had almost convinced himself that this search was madness, that he would wander these streets until his legs gave out, and his heart finally accepted what his mind refused to believe, when he saw her emerge from a bookshop doorway not 30 feet ahead of him, and the world stopped turning on its axis. She was carrying a package wrapped in brown paper that he would later learn contained pressed flowers from the Scottish Highlands, and her hair was different than he remembered, softer and looser around her face, and she moved with an ease he had never witnessed in all the times he had watched her from across ballrooms and drawing-rooms, an ease that spoke of shoulders unburdened and a spirit no longer crushed beneath the weight of constant fear. Frederick felt his knees buckle, and he caught himself against a lamp-post, his breath coming in jagged gasps that fogged the cold air, and he watched as Eleanor paused to adjust her bonnet and smile at a passing child and continued down the street without the slightest flinch when a cart clattered past her with sudden noise, and he realized with a surge of joy so intense it bordered on pain that the bruise was gone, that all the bruises were gone, that she looked healthier and freer and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. And he understood in that moment that approaching her now would be the worst thing he could possibly do. She had escaped, had built something new, had found a way to exist in the world without the shadow of Marcus Pembroke darkening every moment of her life. And Frederick knew that rushing toward her with his heart on his sleeve would only terrify the very person he had spent months trying to find, would only remind her that men were dangerous creatures who could not be trusted to respect the boundaries she had so carefully constructed around her fragile new existence. So he followed at a distance instead, keeping her brown cloak in sight as she wound through the streets toward a respectable townhouse on a quiet lane, and he watched as she was admitted by a servant and the door closed behind her. and he memorized the address and the shape of the windows and the color of the curtains before turning away with his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. That evening, Frederick booked a room at a modest inn around the corner from the townhouse where Eleanor now lived, and he sat on the edge of the narrow bed with his head in his hands and wept for the first time since the funeral. Wept with relief and gratitude, and the terrible knowledge that he had found her, but could not yet reach her, that the woman he loved was alive and breathing and laughing somewhere nearby, and all he could do was wait and watch and pray that when the time came to reveal himself, she would not run from him the way she had run from everything else. The week that followed was both the sweetest torment and the most exquisite education Frederick Sinclair had ever experienced, for he spent those 7 days learning the rhythms of Eleanor Ashworth's new life, with the devoted attention of a scholar studying the most precious manuscript ever discovered, memorizing the way she left the townhouse at precisely 9 each morning with the Fairfax children in tow, their small hands clasped in hers as she walked them to the park where they fed the ducks and laughed at things he could not hear from his careful distance. And he watched the way she tilted her head back when something delighted her, the way her whole body seemed to soften when she was not bracing for pain, the way she had become someone he had only glimpsed in stolen moments at crowded parties, someone radiant and unguarded, and so achingly beautiful that he had to look away sometimes just to catch his breath. On Thursday she returned to the bookshop, as he had somehow known she would, and he waited until she had departed before entering himself, introducing himself to Mr. Greville as a gentleman with an interest in botanical texts, and the bookseller's eyes lit up with recognition of a kindred spirit as he showed Frederick the very shelves where Eleanor had browsed, mentioning that another customer, a young governess with excellent taste, had purchased several volumes on the same subject just last week, and Frederick felt his heart clench at this evidence of the invisible threads connecting them across all these months of separation. On Sunday he watched her enter the church where she sat in the back pew with her head bowed in what he imagined was gratitude for her survival, and he remained outside in the cold rather than risk her seeing him before he was ready, before he had found the words to explain why he had followed her and what he wanted, and how desperately he needed her to understand that he was nothing like the man she had fled. He wrote 12 letters during that week, each one attempting to capture the enormity of what he felt, each one crumpled and thrown into the fire, because nothing he wrote seemed adequate to the task of convincing a woman who had been hurt so badly that he could be trusted with her fragile new peace. It was on the 6th day that Mr. Greville mentioned something that turned Frederick's blood to ice, a casual observation that another gentleman had been asking about a young woman matching Eleanor's description, a man in a red waistcoat who seemed most insistent on learning her whereabouts, and Frederick realized with sickening clarity that Marcus's investigator had traced Eleanor to Scotland and was perhaps only 2 weeks behind him, which meant that the luxury of patience had become a danger he could no longer afford. That night, Frederick made his decision, knowing that approaching Eleanor might shatter everything she had built, knowing she might flee from him as she had fled from Marcus, knowing that warning her of the approaching danger was more important than protecting his own hopes, and he began to plan how he would reveal himself to the woman he loved without becoming yet another man who had stolen her choices away. The morning of March the 1st dawned with frost painting delicate patterns across the windows of Mrs. Fairfax's townhouse, and Eleanor Ashworth knelt in the small garden behind the kitchen, her fingers working gently through the cold soil as she showed the Fairfax daughters how to identify the first green shoots of spring bulbs pushing through the frozen earth, her breath-making soft clouds in the crisp air as she explained that even in the darkest months the flowers had been waiting beneath the surface, gathering strength for this very moment of emergence, and she was so absorbed in this simple, peaceful task that she did not notice the tall figure standing at the garden gate until the younger Fairfax girl looked up with curiosity and asked who the gentleman was. And Eleanor's heart stopped beating entirely as she turned and saw Frederick Sinclair standing not 10 feet away, with his hands held carefully at his sides, palms forward as though approaching a wild creature he feared to startle. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, she recognized him as the man who had whispered at her coffin, the man whose face she had memorized through the rails of the church gallery, the man who had mourned her so genuinely that she had carried the weight of his grief with her all these months. And before she could think, or reason, or plan, she was on her feet and backing away until her shoulder blades pressed against the cold stone of the garden wall, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps that burned her throat. Frederick did not move closer, did not raise his voice, simply stood perfectly still with an expression of such gentle concern that it confused her more than aggression ever could have. And when he spoke, his voice was low and calm and carried no trace of demand or accusation, only a quiet earnestness that penetrated her terror like sunlight through fog. "Miss Ashworth," he said, using her real name for the first time in months, "I am not here to hurt you. I am not here to take you anywhere you do not wish to go. I am here only to warn you that you are in danger and to offer what protection I can." And Eleanor found herself frozen between the desperate urge to flee and the dawning recognition that this man had traveled hundreds of miles, not to capture her, but to stand in a cold garden with his hands visible and his voice gentle, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply offering. The Fairfax children had retreated inside at some signal Eleanor had not seen, and she was alone with him now in the frost-covered garden as the morning sun began to warm the stones and melt the delicate ice crystals into droplets that caught the light like scattered diamonds, and she heard herself speak in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, a voice she hardly recognized as her own. "How did you find me?" she asked, and Frederick's expression shifted into something that looked almost like reverence as he answered, "I looked for you because I could not accept a world in which you no longer existed. And when I learned what he had done to you, what you had escaped, I knew I had to find you before he did." And Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been sealed shut for so very long. Mrs. Fairfax's private parlour was warm with the glow of a fire that crackled softly in the grate, and Eleanor found herself seated in a chair near the window, while Frederick took the seat across from her, leaving a careful distance between them that she recognized as deliberate, as intentional as every other choice he had made since appearing in her garden. And Mrs. Fairfax herself stood by the door with her arms crossed and her expression guarded, having been told only that this gentleman claimed to be a friend from Eleanor's previous life, that he had information of vital importance, and the older woman's protective stance made Eleanor's throat tighten with gratitude for the family she had found in this cold northern city. The tea service sat untouched between them, the cups cooling as Frederick began to speak in that same low, measured voice, telling her everything, how he had attended her funeral with a grief so profound he had not eaten for days afterward, how he had visited her grave every morning to confess the words he had never found the courage to speak while she lived, how the discovery that no body had been recovered had kindled a desperate, impossible hope in his chest, how Dr. Colburn had broken down and revealed the truth of Marcus's cruelty, the bruises and the threats and the escalating violence that had driven her to such desperate measures. And as Frederick spoke, Eleanor watched his face and saw nothing of the cold calculation she had learned to expect from men, saw only earnestness and pain and something that looked remarkably like reverence. When he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat because she recognized it instantly, the sketch she had made of Thornwood Hall's gardens years ago and donated to the church library, and Frederick's voice grew thick as he explained that he had carried it with him every day since discovering it, that he had memorized every line she had drawn, that this small piece of her had been his only comfort during the long months when he believed her lost forever. Mrs. Fairfax quietly excused herself then, murmuring something about checking on the children, and her departure left Eleanor alone with Frederick in a silence that felt charged with all the words neither of them had yet spoken. And it was in that silence that Eleanor finally allowed herself to ask the question that had haunted her since that October morning in the church gallery, her voice barely audible as she leaned forward and met his eyes directly for the first time. "What did you mean," she asked, "when you whispered at my coffin?" And Frederick's composure finally cracked as he realized she had heard him, that she had been there watching her own funeral, that she had carried his words with her all these months just as he had carried her sketch, and when he answered, his voice trembled with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I meant that I would wait for you in whatever world comes after this one," he said, "that I would find you again, even if it took eternity, because I have loved you. Eleanor Ashworth, since the first moment I saw you smile at a party 3 years ago, and I never stopped loving you even when I believed you were gone forever, and I will go on loving you whether you choose to let me stay or send me away, because some loves are not choices we make, but truths we simply cannot escape." The rain began falling against the windows of Mrs. Fairfax's parlour shortly after noon on March the 2nd, and Eleanor sat in the same chair she had occupied the day before, though everything about her had changed in the hours since Frederick's confession, the sleepless night having left dark shadows beneath her eyes and a tremor in her hands that she could not quite still. And when Frederick arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, as he had promised he would, she noticed immediately that he chose a seat even farther from her than yesterday, as though he understood instinctively that she needed space to breathe, space to think, space to feel something other than the suffocating pressure of decisions she was not prepared to make. And in his hands he carried a letter that she recognized instantly as Harriet's handwriting even from across the room, and her heart seized in her chest because she had received a letter of her own that morning, crumpled now in her pocket from the dozen times she had read and reread its desperate words of warning. Harriet writing that Marcus had grown more violent in recent weeks, that he had hired a man named Fleming, who was known for finding people who did not wish to be found, that Eleanor must flee again, and quickly because the hunter was already on her trail. Frederick spoke first, his voice gentle but underlaid with an urgency that had not been present the day before. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and the sound of her real name still startled her each time he used it. "I must tell you something that cannot wait." And Eleanor nodded, because she already knew what he would say, had spent the morning pacing her small room and calculating how many days she might have before her fragile sanctuary crumbled around her, and Frederick explained that he had spoken with Mr. Greville at the bookshop, that another man had been asking questions about a young woman matching her description, that Marcus's investigator was likely already in Scotland and closing the distance with every passing hour. And as he spoke, Eleanor felt the walls of her carefully constructed life beginning to crack and crumble like frost beneath the morning sun. When Frederick finished speaking, he sat in silence, waiting, and Eleanor understood that he was offering her control of what happened next, that he would not push or demand or insist as Marcus always had. And it was this very restraint that made her voice emerge shakier than she intended when she finally asked what options remained to her, and Frederick leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees in a posture that somehow conveyed both earnestness and supplication as he outlined what he had spent, the sleepless night considering, a public revelation that Eleanor Ashworth lived, that she had fled not from madness or scandal, but from genuine danger, that she would be under the protection of the Earl of Sinclair, and any man who sought to harm her would face the full weight of his title and resources, and Eleanor shook her head almost before he finished speaking, because she could not bear the thought of burdening him with her broken life, could not imagine dragging his honorable name through the inevitable scandal. But Frederick pressed on with a different offer, his voice dropping lower as he spoke words she could see cost him dearly to say. "I could offer you marriage," he said, "not as a demand, but as a shield, a legal protection that would make you untouchable by Marcus or anyone else, and you would owe me nothing, Eleanor, nothing but the chance to keep you safe." The fog rolled in from the sea on the evening of March 5th, thick and grey and smelling of salt, and Eleanor stood at the window of her small room, watching the streets below disappear into the mist, while her heart remained as paralyzed as it had been for 3 days, unable to choose between the safety Frederick offered and the independence she had fought so desperately to claim, and she had avoided him since his proposal, sending word through Mrs. Fairfax that she needed time, that she was not ready, that she could not think clearly when he was near with his gentle voice and his patient eyes and his offer of a protection that felt too much like another cage, no matter how kindly gilded. But what Eleanor did not know, as she stood watching the fog swallow the lamplighters and the late pedestrians, was that a man in a distinctive red waistcoat had arrived in Edinburgh that very afternoon, a man named Fleming, who had spent weeks following her trail north with the single-minded determination of a hound who has caught the scent of wounded prey. And even now he was moving through the taverns near the Royal Mile, showing a miniature portrait of Eleanor Ashworth to anyone who would look, asking questions about a young woman who might have arrived in the autumn, who might be working as a governess or a companion, who might have changed her name but could not change the shape of her face or the particular shade of her hair. And Frederick, who had spent the evening walking the streets with growing unease, spotted Fleming outside Mr. Greville's bookshop. Just as the last light faded, recognized him from the description Dr. Colborne had provided months ago, and felt his blood turn to ice in his veins because the hunter had arrived, and time had finally run out. Frederick came to Mrs. Fairfax's door within the hour, his face pale beneath his hat, his voice urgent as he asked to see Miss Archer immediately, and when Eleanor descended the stairs and saw his expression, she knew before he spoke a single word that something terrible had happened, and he told her quickly, efficiently, that Marcus's man was in the city, that he had been asking questions, that someone would remember her soon because Edinburgh was large, but not large enough to hide forever. And Eleanor felt the old familiar terror rise up in her chest like a wave threatening to pull her under, the same terror she had felt when Marcus's hand connected with her face, when his fingers closed around her wrist hard enough to bruise, when he whispered threats against her family if she ever tried to leave, and she might have fled right then into the fog alone if Frederick had not reached out and touched her hand so gently that she barely felt it, saying only that she did not have to run alone anymore, that he had a carriage ready and a safe place prepared, that she could still refuse him and he would help her anyway, because some things mattered more than his own heart, and it was this final proof of his selflessness that broke through Eleanor's walls at last, and she heard herself whisper, yes, she would go with him, not as his wife, but under his protection. And Frederick nodded once and told her to pack only what she could not bear to leave behind. The darkness before dawn on March 6th held a quality of suspended time as Eleanor crept through the servants' entrance of Mrs. Fairfax's townhouse with her small valise clutched against her chest, the locket pressing into her skin beneath her dress, and her journal tucked safely beside the single change of clothes she had permitted herself to bring, and Frederick was waiting exactly where he had promised he would be, standing beside a carriage in the narrow alley behind the house, with his breath misting in the cold air and his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of Fleming or his agents. And when he saw Eleanor emerge from the darkness, something shifted in his expression that she could not quite name, relief and tenderness, and a fierce protectiveness that made her feel simultaneously safe and terrified, because she had learned long ago that men who claimed to protect often became the very danger from which one needed protection. But Frederick made no move toward her, simply opened the carriage door and extended his hand palm upward in an offer rather than a demand, and Eleanor stood frozen for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity before she placed her fingers in his and felt the warmth of his skin even through her thin gloves, and he helped her into the carriage with such gentleness that she found herself blinking back unexpected tears as she settled onto the cushioned seat that smelled faintly of leather and wood smoke, and something clean she was beginning to associate with Frederick himself. The carriage lurched into motion, and Eleanor shivered despite the relative warmth of the enclosed space, her body still responding to the terror of the past hours, even as her mind recognized that she was no longer alone in her flight. And Frederick noticed immediately, removing his heavy wool coat without a word and draping it across her shoulders before settling into the seat opposite her rather than beside her, giving her space even now when they were confined together in this small, moving sanctuary. And the coat carried his warmth and his scent, and Eleanor pulled it closer around herself as the first grey light began to soften the edges of the sky outside the carriage windows, and she watched Frederick's profile as he gazed out at the passing streets of Edinburgh, his jaw tight with tension, but his hands relaxed in his lap, as though he had willed himself to present no threat to her. And she realized with a start that she was not afraid of him. Not truly. Not the way she had been afraid of Marcus, whose every gesture carried the promise of silence. And this absence of fear felt strange and new, like learning to walk again after a long illness. They passed the last buildings of the city, just as the sun crested the eastern hills and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Eleanor turned to look back at the place that had sheltered her for 5 months, the place where she had begun to remember who she was before Marcus had broken her down piece by piece. And Frederick spoke for the first time since they had departed, his voice low and steady, as he told her that Mrs. Fairfax had been given a story about a family emergency and would protect Eleanor's reputation in her absence. And Eleanor nodded, because she could not speak past the tightness in her throat, and the dawn light spilled across Frederick's face as he added quietly that she was safe now, that he would keep her safe. And Eleanor wanted desperately to believe him. The first day of travel passed in a strange, suspended state, where time seemed to move differently inside the carriage than it did in the world beyond the windows, and Eleanor found herself watching the Highland landscape unfold in shades of brown and grey and the occasional startling green of winter moss, while Frederick sat across from her in patient silence that somehow felt more comfortable than any conversation she had ever shared with Marcus, whose silences had always carried the weight of gathering storms. And it was Eleanor who spoke first, surprising herself by asking about the gardens at Thornwood Hall, because she remembered sketching them once from a distance during a house party years ago, and had always wondered if the roses were as beautiful up close as they appeared from the ridge. And Frederick's face transformed when he spoke of his gardens, the careful cultivation of species that should not survive the English winters, but somehow thrived under his attention. And Eleanor listened to him describe the way morning light fell across the east border in summer, and realized she was smiling for the first time in days, perhaps weeks. And when he noticed her smile, he stopped mid-sentence as though he had forgotten how to breathe. The rain began shortly after midday, drumming against the carriage roof in a rhythm that should have felt oppressive, but instead created a sense of intimacy, of shelter shared against the elements. And Frederick asked her carefully, gently, with spaces between his words that gave her room to refuse, about her life before Marcus, about the girl she had been before fear became her constant companion. And Eleanor found herself telling him about her father who had died when she was 16 and left the family in debt that her mother had tried to solve through an advantageous match. About the way Marcus had seemed charming at first, attentive, and how the first time he grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, she had convinced herself it was an accident. And Frederick listened without interruption, his hands clenched in his lap, so tightly his knuckles went white. And when she finished, he said only that he was sorry, so deeply sorry, that no one had protected her. And the simplicity of his words broke something open in Eleanor's chest that she had kept locked away for years. They stopped at a small inn as darkness fell, and Frederick secured separate rooms as he had promised, but they lingered over supper in the private parlour he had arranged, and he told her about Margaret, his first wife, who had died bringing their daughter into the world only for the child to follow her mother 3 days later, and Eleanor saw the grief that still lived behind his eyes, and understood that he knew something about loss that went beyond words. And when they finally parted for the night, Eleanor stood at her door and watched him walk down the corridor and felt something shift in her heart that terrified her more than Fleming ever could, because she was beginning to trust this man, beginning to want things she had sworn never to want again, and she pressed her hand against the locket beneath her dress and whispered a prayer to whoever might be listening that she was not making the worst mistake of her already mistake-laden life. The second day of their journey brought them deeper into the highlands, where the landscape grew wilder and more beautiful with each mile, and Eleanor found herself pressing close to the carriage window to watch the way light played across lochs that appeared suddenly between hills like secrets revealed, and Frederick watched her watching the world with an expression she could not quite decipher when she caught his reflection in the glass, and somewhere between a village whose name she could not pronounce and a stretch of road bordered by ancient pines, she began telling him things she had never told anyone, not even Harriet, about the way Marcus had isolated her so gradually that she had not noticed until she was utterly alone, about the first time he had raised his hand and the shock that had paralyzed her more than the pain, about the nights she had lain awake planning escape routes she never believed she would have the courage to take. And Frederick listened with his whole body, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped so tightly together that she could see the tendons standing out beneath his skin. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he said that he wished he had spoken to her sooner, that he had watched her at gatherings for 3 years and seen something dimming in her eyes and told himself it was not his place to interfere. And the regret in his voice was so raw that Eleanor reached across the space between them without thinking and touched his hand, just briefly, just enough to feel the warmth of him before she pulled back, and the air in the carriage seemed to change after that, charged with something neither of them named. They stopped at another inn as evening fell, and Frederick secured their rooms and ordered supper. Sent up to a private parlour and over roast chicken and potatoes that neither of them tasted. Eleanor asked him about Margaret, wanting to understand the grief she had glimpsed behind his eyes, and he told her about a girl with laughing brown eyes who had loved dancing and had married him when they were both too young to know what marriage meant, and how he had held her hand as she bled and watched the light leave her eyes, and then held his daughter for 3 days before she too slipped away. And Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks for this man who had lost so much and still somehow found the capacity to care about a woman he barely knew. And when Frederick saw her crying, he looked stricken and apologized for burdening her with his sorrows. But Eleanor shook her head and said that grief shared was grief halved, something her father used to say, and Frederick smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face, and said her father sounded like a wise man. And Eleanor laughed through her tears, and said he truly was. And the sound of her own laughter startled her, because she had forgotten she was capable of such lightness, and Frederick looked at her as though she had given him something precious beyond measure. And when they parted for the night, Eleanor lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howl outside and thinking about the way his hand had felt beneath her fingers and the way his smile had made her heart stutter in her chest. The hunting lodge emerged from the mist on the afternoon of March 8th, like something from a fever dream. Stone walls softened by centuries of weather and climbing ivy that even in early spring showed hints of green returning, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as the carriage rolled to a stop, because this place felt safe in a way she had not felt anywhere since childhood. Perhaps not even then. And Frederick watched her face as she took in the view, and something in his expression made her heart stutter, because he looked as though her approval mattered more than anything else in the world. And when he helped her down from the carriage, his hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary, and neither of them acknowledged it. But neither of them forgot it either, and inside the lodge was warm from fires the caretaker had lit in anticipation of their arrival, the rooms filled with the scent of wood smoke and dried lavender, and something indefinably welcoming that made Eleanor want to weep with relief. And Frederick showed her to a bedroom with windows overlooking a small loch where mist still clung to the water's surface like ghosts reluctant to depart. And he stood in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back and told her she was safe here, that no one knew of this place except his most trusted servants, that she could stay as long as she needed, forever if she wished. And Eleanor turned from the window to look at him standing there so carefully distant, so determined not to frighten her. And she asked him why he was doing this, why he had risked so much for a woman he barely knew, and Frederick was quiet for a long moment before he said that he had watched her from across ballrooms and dinner tables for 3 years and seen a light in her dimming month by month, and that he had told himself it was not his place to interfere, that she had family and friends who surely saw what he saw, but that when he learned she was dead, he had understood that silence was its own form of cruelty, and he had vowed never to be silent again. And Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks because no one had ever seen her so clearly. No one had ever noticed the light going out, and she whispered that she did not know how to trust any more, that Marcus had broken something in her that she was not sure could be mended. And Frederick nodded and said he understood, that trust was not given but earned, and that he would spend however long it took proving himself worthy of hers. And then he stepped back into the corridor and closed the door gently behind him. And Eleanor pressed her hand against the wood and felt the warmth of the fire at her back, and the vastness of possibility stretching out before her like the loch beyond the window. And she understood that something fundamental had shifted in her heart, something that terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. And she whispered his name to the empty room just to feel the shape of it on her lips. The days that followed their arrival at the lodge settled into a rhythm that Eleanor had never known before, a gentle cadence of shared meals and quiet conversations and long walks along the loch's edge, where Frederick would name the winter birds that swooped across the grey water, and Eleanor would listen with her heart full of something she was afraid to examine too closely. And on the morning of March 10th, she woke to find snow falling outside her window, soft and silent and impossibly beautiful, and she stood there watching it transform the world into something clean and new until she heard Frederick's voice behind her asking if she would like to walk in it before it melted, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway with 2 cups of steaming chocolate and a look on his face that made her breath catch. And she said yes before she could think of reasons to refuse, and they bundled themselves in wool and fur and stepped out into a world made magical by the falling snow. And Frederick offered her his arm, and she took it without hesitation, feeling the solid warmth of him through layers of fabric, and they walked in companionable silence until Eleanor asked him what he had meant at her funeral, what he had meant by waiting, and Frederick stopped walking and turned to face her with snowflakes catching in his dark hair and on his eyelashes, and he said that he had loved her for 3 years without ever speaking, because he had believed she was happy with Marcus, and that his feelings were his burden to bear alone, and that standing at her grave he had understood that love unspoken was love wasted, and he had promised her ghost that if there was any world beyond this one, he would wait for her there. And Eleanor felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she listened, because no one had ever loved her like this, with such patience and such selflessness. And she asked him what he wanted from her now, and Frederick reached out and brushed a snowflake from her cheek with fingers that trembled slightly, and said he wanted nothing she was not freely willing to give, that he would spend the rest of his life protecting her, even if she never felt for him what he felt for her. And Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw the truth of it there, the absolute absence of demand or expectation. Only hope held so carefully it seemed it might shatter at any moment, and she thought of Marcus, who had taken and taken and taken until there was nothing left, and she thought of this man who offered everything while asking for nothing, and something cracked open in her chest, something that had been frozen for so long she had forgotten it existed, and she whispered that she did not know if she could love anyone after what Marcus had done to her, but that if she could ever love again, it would be him. And Frederick closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against hers, and said that was more than he had ever dared hope for, and they stood there in the falling snow with their breath mingling in the cold air. The snow continued to fall throughout that day and into the evening, blanketing the world in white silence that seemed to exist outside of time itself. And Eleanor found herself drawn again and again to the window of the small sitting room where Frederick had built up the fire until the warmth wrapped around her like an embrace, and she watched him as he read by lamplight, his dark head bent over a volume of poetry, and she thought about how different this was from every moment she had spent in Marcus's presence, where she had learned to make herself small and quiet and invisible. And here Frederick seemed to expand to fill the space she needed, always aware of where she was, but never crowding her, always attentive, but never demanding. And when he looked up and caught her watching him, he smiled, and it was a smile without expectation, without ownership. And Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, like ice breaking on a river in spring. And she crossed the room and sat beside him on the settee, closer than she had ever voluntarily sat to any man since Marcus first raised his hand to her. And Frederick went very still, as though afraid any movement might frighten her away, and Eleanor reached out and took the book of poetry from his hands and read the page he had been studying, a sonnet about love that waits and hopes and endures. And she asked him if he had chosen this passage deliberately, and Frederick admitted that he had been reading the same page for an hour because he could not concentrate on the words when she was in the room. And Eleanor laughed. Actually laughed, a sound that surprised them both because it had been so long since laughter had come easily to her, and Frederick's eyes grew bright with something that looked like tears, and he said her laugh was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. And Eleanor set the book aside and took his hand in hers, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor in his fingers. And she told him that she was beginning to understand what it might mean to be loved rather than possessed. And Frederick lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, so gentle it barely registered as touch. And he said he would spend the rest of his life teaching her the difference if she would let him. And outside, the snow continued to fall, and inside, the fire crackled and popped, and Eleanor leaned her head against Frederick's shoulder and felt for the first time in years that she might actually be safe, that she might actually deserve happiness, that the frozen thing inside her might actually thaw if given enough warmth and patience and time. And Frederick wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they sat together watching the flames dance, and neither of them spoke because some moments are too precious for words, and this was one of them, suspended in amber, perfect and fleeting and eternal all at once. The morning of March 11th brought a stillness to the lodge that felt like the world holding its breath, and Eleanor woke to find the snow had stopped falling some time in the night, leaving behind a landscape so pristine and untouched that it seemed impossible anything ugly or cruel could exist in such a world. And she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around her, and thinking about the man sleeping somewhere below her in the room he had insisted she take, because it had the better view and the warmer fireplace, and she thought about how Marcus would have taken the best room without a second thought, would have expected her gratitude for whatever scraps of comfort he deigned to provide, and the contrast made something ache in her chest, because she was beginning to understand that everything she had believed about men and love and marriage had been shaped by a monster who had convinced her his cruelty was normal, and Frederick was showing her day by day and hour by hour that gentleness was not weakness, and patience was not indifference, and love did not have to hurt. And when she finally rose and dressed and made her way downstairs, she found him already awake and standing at the window with a cup of tea in his hands, and a look of such peaceful contentment on his face that she stopped in the doorway just to watch him for a moment, and he must have sensed her presence, because he turned and smiled, and that smile reached his eyes in a way that Marcus's calculated charm never had, and he asked her if she had slept well, and she told him she had slept better than she had in years, which was the simple truth, and they shared breakfast in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional observation about the weather or the beauty of the snow-covered hills visible through the frost-edged windows. And afterward, Frederick suggested they walk to a viewpoint he remembered from childhood visits to this lodge, a place where you could see all the way to the next valley on a clear day. And Eleanor agreed because she found she wanted to go anywhere he suggested, wanted to spend every possible moment in his company before reality intruded and decisions had to be made, and they wrapped themselves warmly and set out into a world transformed by snow into something from a fairy story. And Frederick offered his arm, and Eleanor took it without the hesitation that had marked her first weeks of knowing him, and they walked through the white silence with their boots crunching on the frozen crust, and their breath making clouds in the cold air. And when they reached the viewpoint, Frederick had promised she gasped at the beauty spread before them, miles of white and grey and the pale blue of distant mountains, and Frederick watched her face rather than the view, and when she turned to ask him why he was not looking at the landscape, he said quietly that he had seen these hills 100 times, but he had never seen her face lit up with wonder, and that was the more precious sight. And Eleanor felt her heart turn over in her chest because this man saw her, truly saw her, and found her worthy of attention. They stood together on that hilltop overlooking the snow-covered valley for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, and Eleanor found herself telling Frederick things she had never told anyone, not even Harriet, about the dreams she had abandoned when Marcus first made her understand that her thoughts and hopes and desires belonged to him now, about the books she had wanted to write, and the places she had wanted to see, and the life she had imagined for herself, before her mother sold her to a monster for the price of cleared debts and social standing. And Frederick listened without interrupting, his arm steady beneath her gloved hand, his breath making soft clouds in the cold air. And when she finally fell silent, he told her that none of those dreams were dead, only sleeping, and that if she would let him, he would help her wake every single one of them. And Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes because she had forgotten what it felt like to be encouraged rather than diminished, to be seen as a person with her own hopes rather than an ornament to be displayed or a possession to be controlled. And Frederick noticed the brightness in her eyes and produced a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her without comment. And she took it and pressed it to her face, and smelled that clean wood-smoke scent that she was beginning to associate with safety. And when she could speak again, she asked him why he had never approached her during all those years when they moved in the same circles and attended the same balls and saw each other across crowded rooms. And Frederick's face grew shadowed with old regret as he admitted that he had believed himself unworthy of her. A widower with a dead wife and a dead child, and a heart, he thought, too broken to offer anyone. And Eleanor stared at him in disbelief, because she had spent those same years believing herself unworthy of anyone's genuine affection, and the tragic comedy of their parallel misunderstandings made her laugh even as the tears continued to fall, and Frederick smiled at her laughter even though he did not quite understand it. And Eleanor tried to explain that they had both been fools, magnificent fools, wasting years in silence when they might have saved each other so much pain. And Frederick agreed, but added that perhaps they had needed those years to become the people who could recognize each other now. And Eleanor considered this, and found wisdom in it, because the frightened girl she had been at 20 would not have been able to trust this gentle man, would have been too thoroughly convinced by Marcus that kindness was merely a prelude to cruelty. And she told Frederick this, and he nodded slowly, and said that perhaps everything had happened exactly as it needed to happen, even the terrible parts, especially the terrible parts, because those terrible parts had led them here to this hilltop in the snow where they stood together looking out at a world made new and white and full of possibility. And Eleanor tightened her grip on his arm and leaned into his warmth, and thought that perhaps he was right.